we'll talk about him later. All right, so hey folks, it is February the 2nd, and today we're going to talk a bit more about the Cold War series that we're going over. And so we left off last time talking about McCarthyism, and before that we're talking about the Korean War. And so we're seeing that things for the United States, both at home and abroad, is getting very entangled with our distrust of the Soviet Union and our policies to try to make sure that communism doesn't spread at home or in the world. And so it's going to lead us to these two guys. That is, Dwight D. Eisenhower and Richard Nixon. And so Eisenhower he was the general in charge of American forces fighting the Nazis in World War II. And it happens time and time again in U.S. history. If you're a really good general and you're likable and you win a really big war, you're probably going to be president. And Nixon had gained popularity by kind of being one of the more successful guys behind the McCarthyism movement, helping to do things like put on show trials and rooting out communist sympathizers, stuff like that. He's much younger than Eisenhower, but he's very intelligent, so he had some talent. So let's see about that. So, riding high on their popularity and rooting out communist sympathizers, the Republican Party was optimistic in their presidential aspirations. So you got to remember, before Eisenhower, you had Democrat President Truman. And so, that's a pretty normal thing in U.S. politics. We go from one party to the other and then the other. We kind of bounce back and forth. And so now it was the time for the other party to take over. The Republicans chose General Eisenhower as their candidate, with Richard Nixon as the vice presidential candidate. In 1952, Eisenhower defeated a guy called Adlai Stevenson with 83% of the electoral votes. That's big. So you can think about it as 83% of the states chose Eisenhower. So we call that a big landslide. People thought of Eisenhower as a kind, neighborly war hero who preferred to leave lawmaking to elected officials in Congress. So his nickname was Ike. And so during the presidential campaign, there were buttons and signs that would say, "I like Ike." So it's kind of like the slogan. As president, he acted kind of like a general. He relied heavily on his cabinet officials, made up of various experts, and he would listen to them talk over the issues, but he always made the final decision. So a lot of it had to do with delegation, and so he didn't try to rule from the presidency. He tried to have, because Congress are the ones who are supposed to actually make the rules, and the president is supposed to be the enforcer, and so he believed in that. However, like the general was, he always made the final decision after hearing their advice. And so Eisenhower is going to be, he's going to be somebody who's going to be involved in the Cold War. But even though he was a general and had won many battles, he didn't believe in sending the United States into other countries to fight in the Cold War. He wanted to stay out of that as much as possible. And so we're going to see that when it comes to issues like Vietnam, when it comes up later, he's going to want the United States to stay out of it. And when it comes to other hot spots as well, he wants to prevent war. Just because he's a general doesn't mean he wants to make war. I think it's because he realizes just exactly what it means. Whereas somebody who hasn't seen war might be real naive and think that things will turn out better for them. So. So one thing we're going to see kind of get built up during the days of Eisenhower and then Nixon is the building of the interstate, the highway system. So we'd already talked about how cars were transforming America. Well, they're becoming more and more part of America. As we talked about before, cities are being built with cars in mind. Houses are built with driveways. Um, built like businesses are starting to build parking lots, things like that. So everybody's thinking about the automobile. Cars get you to where you need to go. So you got to make sure people and places are ready to accept cars. So the Eisenhower administration promised to stop communist aggression in what he called the New Look. So, like we talked about, every time president comes in, they have their own policy name. So you had like the New Deal and stuff like that, if you'll recall. So his was called the New Look. The strength behind the policy was the threat of massive retaliation if American interest was threatened. So he was like, hey, if you put us in danger, we'll nuke you. This leads to a term called brinkmanship. Like if you're on the brink of war, that means it's about to happen, right? It's right on the edge of tipping over. And so brinkmanship is the threat of being on the brink of war in order to make your opponent back down. It's like you're just like, I'm so crazy. If you mess with me, you're over. In 1952, the U.S. exploded its first hydrogen bomb on the Marshall Islands in the Pacific, and it proved to be many times stronger than the original atomic bomb. Yeah, a lot more, like tens of times stronger. So like, I'm not sure the scale, but the first ones are a lot stronger, but the later ones they build. So like, yeah, sure, like the first atomic bombs they made, like the Fat Boy they call them, would be able to take out a whole city, right? And that's what we dropped in Japan. But these new ones are getting so big that they can take out a county and then eventually a whole state. And so they're going to get really big, like scary, scary big. In the U.S., citizens prepare for nuclear war with the Soviets. We're all like, everybody's arming up. The militaries are getting stronger and they're making super dangerous weapons. And so a lot of people are getting very nervous and fearful about that. So they're stocking up supplies and they're trying to prepare themselves the best way possible to try to survive a nuclear holocaust. Eisenhower reviewed the situation in Korea and signed a truce. He's like, this war is unwinnable. We got to end it. Korea was then left with a demilitarized zone dividing North and South. And it's still there today. So it was established, we see, in the early 50s. And here we go all the way back to 2021. And you still have this zone, this line in between North and South Korea. That's a no man's land. People who try to cross it against the law could get shot. And you still have armies essentially ready to fight one another there all these years later, 70 years later. So yeah, I had the picture of the interstate up there. So I might have mentioned it last time, but Eisenhower admired the Autobahn in Germany. The Autobahn is like their interstate, big roads. They're raised up off the ground and they're very wide. They're raised up so that tanks can drive on them without tearing them up. And they're very wide, not just so you can have traffic, but so that airplanes like bombers can land on them. So they weren't just there. Interstates like I-20 aren't just there made with the intention for commerce and travel. It's also made in case we're like invaded. Our military could use the roads in order to like emergency airport or to transport troops and stuff like that and supplies. So they passed it as kind of like a national defense measure. So. And that was one way also for them to get funding for it, because like there's been in history where the federal government has made things like roads and canals and helped out a bit with the railroads, but it was a lot of times it was kind of like a partnership thing with like private companies and stuff, especially the railroads. Ugh, but that was pretty corrupt. So. We had our quiz.
I got something in the Gmail. It's like dual credit, Sentinel and Federal is 10.
Yeah, it's because I was out yesterday. I had to make something for them to do.
I'm on dual credit.
You're not. It went to everybody. When I make this, they use the same Google Classroom you do. But yeah, don't worry. If it says DC or dual credit, you don't have to do it. And if you want to do it, it's fine. I'm having him read one of the Federalist Papers and one of the Anti-Federalist Papers that kind of talk generally about the same thing. So you had a group of people who were for the Constitution, a group of people who were against it. And so they're having kind of like an intellectual debate against, for, and against. And, we all know the for side won because we have a Constitution. So, all right, let's go to the next one. Oh yeah, this is an Israeli soldier looking into like a cafe's window. So like the Middle East, we're gonna find is still gonna be a mess. It's gonna be a hot zone where a lot of people are scared where World War III could start. So, and sometimes today, things flare up. Sometimes there's like even within your lifetime, there've been times where like there's been war regarding Israel, or of course, like there's been problems still with Syria and all these other countries in the Middle East where people are kind of worried that if too many of the big countries get involved, we might start fighting each other and start a world war. So it's one of the dangerous things about global conflict is it can draw in other nations. And if you draw in other nations, it could become a great, big, fat, terrible war because armies are much more like deadly than they used to be. And that scares people to death. All right, Cold War expands. That's a typo. Then the Eisenhower administration, I think, is what I meant to put, then made multilateral defensive agreements. So multilateral is like this. Unilateral is when one country makes a decision. My country's going to do this. Bilateral is when two countries have an agreement, like a peace treaty. We agree we're not going to fight one another. We're going to have a bilateral agreement. Multilateral is when you have a bunch of countries make a decision together, right? And so they're going to make multilateral defensive agreements with countries throughout the world. The Southeast Asia Organization, CETO, and the Central Treaty Organization, CENTO. You don't have to write those down, but those are like NATO, which is something you should know. And NATO's whole purpose was for the United States would help defend Europe from Russia taking over. Well, we made similar agreements with parts of Asia and parts of South America where we're going to help protect you from the Russians. And they're like, okay, that's cool. Then the Soviets would respond with their own Warsaw Pact, joining their allies with their own defensive pact. So then the Russians would make an agreement with Eastern European countries and say, hey guys, if you join with us, we'll protect you from those nasty Europeans. But the difference is like where we were largely voluntary, that we did kind of buy off some countries, they bought countries and forced countries into their side. And so you still see, yeah.
So we're like working around
Like what?
manipulate. Is it kind of like manipulating?
Well,
Like saying like.
I mean, you could say it, but like they're benefiting, like
do people believe in like what they want them to believe in, and then whatever.
well, I mean, we did have things like propaganda and stuff like that, but like a lot of these countries, yeah, it's a hard time for them to say no because we'd offer them so much money and military supplies.
I mean, they was so.
So we kind of, I guess it's almost like a bribe, really,
Yeah.
So like you'll notice a lot of countries in the world, one of the things that helps you understand what countries was in the Warsaw side, what countries were in like the NATO side, is like part of being a NATO country means that you have to agree to certain military standards. And that means that certain things have to be interchangeable. If we got into a war together, in an emergency, we should be able to share each other's fuel. So we have to agree to use the same kind of fuel. We have to agree that our soldiers can at least exchange ammunition if they need to. So they'll have standardized ammunition that our soldiers can change out. And so you'll notice a lot of the countries that are on the NATO side might use things like M16s or weapons that use a variant of that ammunition or a variant of our standard machine gun ammo and stuff like that. Warsaw was a flip. And so Warsaw countries would be like, they would have things that were interchangeable, but we couldn't use. So like you'll notice like instead of M16s, they would have AK-47s. And so they would have certain ammunition they could share with their allies. And it even came down to other standard non-war things too. And so often we would trade with fellow NATO countries. Well, Warsaw countries would trade with one another and they would make their things differently. And so like, whereas in America, we made our things by the English standard, by like inches and pounds and miles and stuff like that. They would make theirs on the metric system. And even things like screws would go backwards. Whereas like we're like righty-tighty, they're like righty-loosey. So you can't even change out like nuts and bolts. It just go the wrong way. So like this. So all right. So seeking influence in the region, the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, that's our spy network in America, helped topple pro-Soviet governments in Iran. And then we installed a pro-American Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. And so if you remember, right after the war, the Soviets invaded Iran. And then the world got together and told them to get out. And they got out. But they helped install a pro-communist government. And so then what we did after that is we used our spy network to help topple that government and install this Shah guy who's very pro-American, but he's known for being very corrupt. And we're going to see later on in the 70s, the Iranians are going to have a radical Islamic-based revolution where they're going to overthrow the government and they're going to take over one of our embassies and a whole bunch of other things. It's very, you okay?
Yeah.
Okay. This should be very embarrassing. It's going to be very embarrassing for the Americans. All right. So now going on to Egypt. So we're talking about like hot spots in the world where we're having like a lot of problems regarding people are really worried what side are people going to join. So in Egypt, they're going to have pretty much a dictatorship. But then you're going to see this one guy, Gamal Nasser. He's going to be an Egyptian military lieutenant. And he's going to get other military officers to join over and agree to make him into the country's ruler. And so then one day during a military parade, the president and all of his family and all of his government officials are up in the stands watching the military parade. And Nasser and his military allies turn all of their weapons and just gun down everybody in the stadium and take over the government. And so now he's going to be very, very crafty. He's going to play the United States and the Soviets against each other, where he's going to say, hey, U.S., if you give me this and this, I might consider you my friend and let you do this and that in my country. He would take the money and be like, well, hey, Russians, look what they gave me. What will you give me? And then the Russians would give it. And so he managed to do that. And he eventually stayed rather independent, but he would kind of choose the Russians. And they would do things like they would build, what's the name of that? They built a huge dam on the Nile River to make electricity and stuff like that. But it's going to be very destructive to the ecosystem there. But yeah, he's going to be, U.S. is going to be manning him for a while.
Didn't the Nile River run dry?
Nah, it didn't run dry, but a lot of the land around it got dry. That had been farmland for thousands of years. And all of a sudden, the water was more trickling and stuff like that. So a lot of the area did dry.
Yeah.
Like this.
I didn't know.
Yeah, so-
Sorry. So yeah.
You gotta-
Hey, so more on the Middle East. In 1956, Israeli forces invade Egypt and with British and French support. So if you remember, Israel was a new country, but a lot of the Arabic states were extremely mad because they claimed that the Israelis had stolen the land. And so you had that war, if you remember, where many nations invaded Israel, but Israel totally whooped them. Like and they did it in a way that made it look easy, which humiliated a lot of these Arab states. Israel is going to invade Egypt because there's a region on eastern Egyptian soil that the Israelis claim is historically theirs. And so this isn't going to quite, this is going to really worry the world because we're going to be really scared that since France and Britain are the friends with Israel, who are our friends, that looks like our side is essentially invading Egypt, which is the Russian side. And so we're like, oh no, this might be World War III. So people are really, really scared about that. Oh yeah, this picture, this is actually a picture from Cuba after the Cuban Revolution. This is after the Cuban Revolution when the communists took over, they did a whole lot of executions, show trials. Some of them were mass executions. Some of them, they would just take family members out and shoot them just to make an example, to make sure that the others don't revolt.
Yeah.
And so this is a guy getting his last rites before the firing squad gets him. And so there was a lot of that. Oh yeah, so it's gonna be the last one today, and then we're gonna go talk about Cuba tomorrow. So, fearing that the invasion into Egypt would lead into World War III, America and the Soviets joined together as Eisenhower sponsored a United Nations resolution to end the conflict. So, like, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, the United States and Russia, we really didn't want to go to war with each other. We prepared for war. We were super scared of each other. But we knew just how deadly World War III would be if both sides had nuclear weapons. So a UN resolution. So that means the United Nations got together, and a resolution, it's not quite a law, but it's where all the nations come together and say, you better do this, or all of us nations in the world are going to do something about it. It could be a threat of war, sanctions, stuff like that. Like, nobody's going to trade with you or anything like that. So, following Israel, France's, and Britain's withdrawal from Egypt, Congress here in the United States agreed to fund $200 million in what's known as the Eisenhower Doctrine, which would improve militaries and economies in the Middle East. So if you remember all the way back when we were talking about, like, say, President Taft, he had like what was called like dollar diplomacy. And so the idea was by helping out economically our South American neighbors, they would be more of our friends and it would improve their countries. Well, Eisenhower is going to do something similar in the Middle East. And so we're going to provide money to Middle Eastern countries, military training, and stuff like that. But as you can see, it didn't really work out that well. I mean, even today, a lot of countries in that part of the world, the way their militaries are set up is it's almost like a class-based system in some places, where like, yeah, they have an air force, but it's pretty much the only people who fly might be like the royal family, and because they don't trust the commoners enough, or it's like they might have like some place like Saudi Arabia, they might have the best military equipment in the world, but they never really train with it or anything, So in Cuba, the U.S. had long held an economic advantage and controlled much of the island's industries throughout. We're going to stop there. We're going to pick up on Cuba next time. So we see that like the Middle East was totally chopped up. They made Britain and France made all of these countries in the Middle East that didn't exist before. So people who don't really have a lot of history sharing a government now all of a sudden did. And so that's making a lot of turmoil and stuff. Like Syria used to be a much, much bigger area. Iraq was invented at the end of World War I. Israel is pretty much going to be a country that hadn't existed in like a very long time, since the days of the Romans got rid of them in what's known as the Great Diaspora. But yeah, so all of these things are there, and so it's a very unstable region. And now the superpowers are looking at them, and so everybody's scared the Middle East is going to be a great big war. Let me check one thing real quick.
Yeah, I love it. That's what I love.
Online.
Mm.
Hey, did y'all check your quiz grades yet?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I haven't.
I know what happened. All right, so I mean, it looks good. I mean, the average is good. The average is good. If you found out you failed your quiz and you want a bonus option, just ask me. I'll get you to do something. All right, so I know that a couple of you who are online have not completed your quiz yet. Please go online and do that. And you don't have to do the dual credit assignment that I posted yesterday. That's for those students who were in class yesterday because I needed a sub yesterday. So you're off the hook. All right, otherwise, I'll talk to you Thursday. All right.